Flames raced along the canvas seams as burning arrows pierced the command tent. Amidst the screaming guards and clashing steel, the orphaned maiden lunged through the smoke. Her cold fingers seized the heavy iron gauntlet of the Alpha King. She pressed her face against his armored arm, her knuckles whitening with terror. "Don't let go of my hand!" she cried, her voice cracking over the roar of the fire. Instead of stepping back, the sovereign of Acadia wrapped his arm around her waist. He lifted her clear of the mud, drawing his dark steel blade as a dozen enemies closed in for the kill. 3 days earlier, none of this made sense. The heavy embers of the burnt palisade drifted through the midnight air. Smoke hung thick over the border valley of Shenando, masking the broken remnants of the village. Charles stood alone near the center of the ruined courtyard. His iron armor reflected the dull glow of the fading fires. 10 winter campaigns had carved his face into a mask of stone. Whispers carried his name ahead of his marching legion, spoken only in hushed, frightened tones. He was the sovereign who had once broken 3 rebel keeps in a single night without raising his voice. Members of the High Council rarely dared to meet his amber gaze. To the soldiers of Acadia, Charles was a living weapon, devoid of hesitation or mercy. He watched the cleanup of the skirmish with hollow indifference. The enemy had fled hours ago, leaving behind only the civilian stragglers who could not outrun a cavalry. A sharp cry shattered the quiet murmur of the wind. Near the supply wagons, the remaining villagers huddled together in the freezing mud. They were mostly the elderly and the young women who had lost their families to the long border wars. Among them was Chloe, a young woman with a torn wool shawl wrapped tightly around her trembling shoulders. She knelt in the dirt, trying to stop the bleeding on an old man's forehead. The old baker had stumbled and fallen when the soldiers ordered the prisoners to move now. He lay gasping in the cold mud, unable to stand. A heavy pair of steel-toed boots stopped right in front of them. It was the captain of the Royal Guard, his face hidden beneath a dark helm. Imperial law in Acadia was simple during wartime. Anyone unable to keep pace with the royal baggage train was silenced to preserve rations. "Stand up, old man," the captain ordered, his hand resting on the hilt of his short sword. "The march begins in 10 minutes. If you cannot walk, you stay here permanently." "Please, give him a moment," Chloe said, her voice shaking but clear in the cold air. "He just needs a little water. I can support his weight on the road. He has done nothing to harm your men." The captain drew his blade. The steel scraped against leather with a harsh screech, cutting through the murmurs of the frightened captives. He did not care about her promises. A slow march meant a vulnerable supply line. "Step aside, woman," the captain warned, raising his weapon, "or share his fate." Chloe did not move away. Instead, she threw her body over the old man, shielding his frail frame with her own. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, but she closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable strike. She had lost her parents to the winter sickness years ago. This village was the only home she knew, and these people were the only family she had left. She would not let them die alone in the dirt. Suddenly, a heavy silence fell over the courtyard. The restless stomping of the war horses ceased. The murmurs of the soldiers vanished, replaced by the sound of boots scraping backward in sudden panic. Charles stepped out from the shadows of the ruined chapel. He moved without making a sound, yet his mere presence seemed to suck the air from the courtyard. The soldiers immediately dropped to one knee, bowing their heads toward the freezing mud. No one spoke. The fear he commanded was absolute. Charles walked slowly toward the supply wagons, his dark cape sweeping over the ash-covered ground. He looked down at the captain, his expression unreadable. The captain froze mid-swing, his face turning pale as he scrambled backward and dropped to his knees. His sword clattered against the stones. "My lord," the captain whispered, his voice trembling with genuine terror. "They are slowing the supply train. I was only enforcing your edict." Charles did not look at the captain, his amber eyes fixed on the young woman kneeling in the dirt. Chloe slowly opened her eyes and looked up. The man standing before her was massive, his broad shoulders blocking out the light of the fires behind him. She could feel the crushing weight of his aura. This was the Alpha King. This was the man who held the power of life and death over thousands, a man whose name was a curse on the lips of his enemies. Chloe knew she was going to die. But as she looked at the cold, unyielding lines of his face, something deeper than fear surged within her chest. It was a desperate, burning instinct to save the only life she could. Before anyone could react, Chloe pushed herself up from the mud. She lunged forward, closing the distance between them in a single breath, and grabbed his heavy steel gauntlet with both hands. The air in the courtyard turned to ice. Every soldier nearby went deathly quiet. To touch the sovereign without permission was an offense punished by immediate execution. For 3 winters, no commoner had ever dared to come within 5 paces of Charles without falling to the ground, let alone lay hands upon his battle armor. The captain squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the king to sever the woman's head from her shoulders. Charles slowly lowered his gaze to the small hands gripping his iron fingers. Her skin was freezing, her knuckles white with the strain of her grip. He felt the light tremor running through her palms, yet her hold remained fierce. Her face was stained with soot, and her dark hair was matted with dust. Yet when she looked up into his face, her light blue eyes held an undeniable flame of quiet defiance. There was no deceit in her gaze, only raw, unspoken devotion for the old man behind her. "Unconscious insolence!" The captain swore softly under his breath, not daring to move. Charles did not pull his hand away. His gloved fingers remained rigid under her touch. He stared down at her, feeling a strange sensation pierce through the numbness that had clouded his mind for a decade. It was warmth. "You dare to touch the sovereign of Acadia?" Charles asked softly. His tone was stripped of all emotion, but it carried a quiet authority that commanded the attention of everyone present. "I dare to ask for mercy," Chloe whispered. Her grip tightened on his iron glove, as if it were the only anchor left in a crumbling world. "Please, don't let go of my hand. Spare him." A strange tension hung in the air between them. Charles looked into her eyes for a long, silent moment. He read every ounce of her fear, and beneath it, a courage he had not seen in his own war council. She was offering her own life for a man who was not even her blood. He felt the fragile beat of her pulse against his steel gauntlet. It was a delicate rhythm, so small compared to the brutal drums of war he was accustomed to. Slowly, Charles turned his head toward the kneeling captain. "Put the old man in the medical cart," Charles ordered. His voice cut through the frosty air with quiet finality. The soldiers stared in disbelief, keeping their heads bowed low. Nobody dared to question the command. A king who never spared the weak had just rewritten his own law. "And the woman, my lord?" the captain asked hesitantly, his eyes fixed firmly on the mud. Charles looked back down at Chloe. She slowly released his gauntlet, her hands falling to her sides as the reality of her survival washed over her. "Bring her with the main guard," Charles said, his amber eyes never leaving her face. "She rides near the front." As the guards hurriedly led Chloe and the old man away, Charles stood alone in the freezing wind. He looked down at his iron gauntlet. The physical heat of her hands had already faded into the winter air, but an unfamiliar warmth lingered deep within his chest, setting a dangerous spark to a heart that had long forgotten how to beat for another. The wind roared through the Shenandoah Valley. It carried the sharp bite of early winter. The marching column of Acadia stretched across the snow-dusted plains like a steel serpent. Chloe walked alongside the forward supply carts. Her thin boots sank into the freezing mud with every step. Charles had ordered her to travel with the main guard. This rare mercy spared her the brutal pace of the rear baggage train. Yet, the journey remained unforgiving for a village woman. Her muscles burned with deep exhaustion. Her torn shawl offered minimal protection against the dropping temperature. She kept her head down. She focused on the rhythmic sound of iron boots striking the frozen earth. She refused to stop. She refused to ask for rest. The old baker was safely tucked inside a medical wagon. Her reckless gamble had saved his life. She drew quiet strength from that simple fact, pushing her aching legs forward. Ahead of the column, Charles rode his warhorse. He formed a dark silhouette against the gray winter sky. His iron armor seemed to absorb the faint daylight. He never looked back. He sat tall in the saddle, seemingly unbothered by the frost. Chloe watched his broad back whenever the wind allowed her to look up. She remembered the lingering warmth of his skin beneath his steel gauntlet. It was a puzzling memory that kept her moving forward through the snow. The snowfall thickened as afternoon faded into evening. The landscape turned into a blinding white expanse. The royal guards marched in grim silence. They were hardened veterans who understood the harsh cost of obscure warfare. They frequently cast sideways glances at Chloe. Their eyes harbored unspoken suspicion. A commoner had no place among the elite vanguard. A captive who dared to touch their leader should have been executed on the spot. Chloe ignored their stares. She focused on breathing, counting her steps to numb the pain in her feet. The temperature continued to plummet, turning the mud into treacherous ice. She stumbled once, scraping her knees against the frozen ground. She quickly forced herself upright. She would not give the soldiers a reason to leave her behind in the snow. Twilight finally swallowed the valley. A sharp horn blast signaled the end of the day's march. The column halted in a sheltered clearing surrounded by towering pines. Tents went up with practiced efficiency. Soldiers moved quickly to establish the perimeter and build fires. The smell of wood smoke and roasting rations began to fill the freezing air. Chloe found a quiet corner near the edge of the vanguard camp. She huddled against a stack of wooden crates, trying to block the wind. A quartermaster tossed her a meager ration. It was a piece of hard bread and a strip of dried meat. She caught it with numb fingers. It was barely enough to sustain a working man, but to her, it was a feast. She brought the bread to her lips, seeking any comfort. Before she could take a bite, a heavy boot kicked the dirt near her feet. Snow showered over her lap. Chloe looked up in surprise. 3 soldiers stood over her. They wore the chainmail of the vanguard, their faces obscured by the dim firelight. The tallest soldier sneered. His hand rested casually on the hilt of his hunting dagger. "Look at this," the tall soldier mocked, stepping closer. "The little charity case gets a royal portion. Tell me, girl, what did you do to earn a spot in the vanguard?" "I am only following orders," Chloe said quietly. She pulled her knees to her chest, keeping her voice steady. "I do not want any trouble." "Trouble is exactly what you brought us," another soldier spat. His breath formed white clouds in the cold air. "We are carrying extra weight because of you and that useless old man. Rations are tight. That bread belongs to men who actually fight." He reached down to snatch the food from her hands. Chloe reacted instinctively. She twisted away, hiding the bread against her chest. She stared back at him with fierce eyes. "The quartermaster gave this to me," Chloe stated. Her voice hardened despite her shivering frame. "I will not give it to you." The tall soldier laughed. It was a harsh sound that echoed over the crackling fire. He drew his dagger. The steel caught the orange light of the flames. "You think because the king spared you once, you are untouchable," he whispered, leaning down. "He has already forgotten you exist. A frozen corpse in the morning is a common sight. Give me the bread, or I will take it from your cold hands." Chloe did not back away. Fear gripped her throat, but she refused to surrender. She survived sickness and starvation in her youth. She would not break before these men. She lifted her chin, meeting the soldier's threatening gaze with quiet defiance. Suddenly, the crackling of the nearby fire seemed to falter. The wind died down, replaced by a suffocating stillness. The air grew heavy, pressing against their lungs like a physical weight. The tall soldier froze. The cruel smirk vanished from his face. He slowly turned his head. He looked past Chloe into the darkness, between the tents. Charles stood there. He made no sound as he walked into the firelight. He wore no helmet. The winter wind swept back his dark hair. His amber eyes locked onto the 3 soldiers. There was no anger in his gaze, only a terrifying emptiness that promised absolute destruction. The 3 men collapsed to their knees. Their weapons fell into the snow. They pressed their foreheads against the frozen dirt, trembling violently. "Mercy, my lord," the tall soldier gasped. His voice broke in sheer panic. "We were merely joking with the prisoner." Charles did not speak. He did not even look at the kneeling men. He walked past them, his boots crushing the snow with deliberate slowness. The silence he commanded was far more deadly than any drawn sword. The soldiers stopped breathing, waiting for the execution order. Charles stopped in front of Chloe. He looked down at her. She was shivering visibly. Her face was pale from the cold and the adrenaline. She still clutched the hard bread tightly against her chest, her blue eyes wide as she looked up at him. For a long moment, the king and the commoner simply looked at each other. The invisible barrier of power and status seemed to dissolve in the quiet space between them. Chloe saw the exhaustion hidden deep within his amber eyes. Slowly, Charles reached up. He unclasped the silver pin at his neck. He took off his thick wolf fur cloak. The fabric was lined with rich velvet and carried the faint scent of leather and pine. Without a single word, he leaned forward. He draped the massive cloak over Chloe's trembling shoulders. The sudden warmth engulfed her. The heavy fur shielded her entirely from the biting wind. It smelled like him, safe, imposing, and undeniably real. Chloe reached up, her fingers gripping the soft fur in disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer thanks, that the words caught in her throat. Charles withdrew his hands. His amber eyes lingered on her face for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then, he turned away. He walked back into the darkness of the camp. He ignored the trembling soldiers who remained frozen on the ground. He left no orders, no threats, and no explanations. Chloe pulled the dark cloak tighter around herself. The residual heat from his body seeped into her bones, chasing away the winter chill. She watched his tall silhouette disappear into the falling snow. She realized that the most dangerous man in the kingdom had just given her his only shield against the cold. The blizzard finally broke the marching pace. Thick snow buried the Shenandoah Trail by midnight, forcing the Acadian vanguard to halt. The war camp was a sea of shivering men and stamping horses. Charles sat at the head of a heavy table inside the command tent. The canvas snapped violently against the wind. His war council stood around him in tense silence. General Torrin pointed a gloved finger at the parchment map. The general looked grim. "The supply line is breaking," Torrin argued. "We are carrying too much dead weight. The winter is worsening." Charles stared at the map. He did not speak. He traced the route to the enemy fortress with a steady gaze. "If we abandon the captives and the medical carts, the vanguard can reach the fortress by dawn," Torrin continued. "The enemy is waiting. We cannot risk the campaign for civilian stragglers." Charles lifted his gaze, his amber eyes fixed on the general. "No, my lord, the rations will not last," a captain added nervously. "The men are freezing. We must cut the weak loose." "I said no," Charles repeated. His voice was low. It carried no anger, yet it silenced the generals instantly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop further. "Anyone who suggests leaving the carts behind will walk into the storm without armor," Charles stated calmly. "Are we understood?" The council members exchanged fearful glances. They bowed their heads in unison. "Yes, my lord," they murmured. They filed out of the tent quickly. They did not dare to question his sudden mercy. They knew better than to test his patience. Charles remained alone in the flickering light. He rubbed his temples, fighting a persistent headache born of exhaustion. Outside, Chloe huddled near the medical wagon. She buried her face in the wolf fur cloak. The thick material smelled of leather and pine. It shielded her from the deadly wind. She checked on the old baker, ensuring he was asleep beneath some woolen blankets. A royal guard approached her through the snow. He held a brass lantern. The light illuminated the heavy snowfall. "The king summons you," the guard announced. His voice was flat. Fear spiked in her chest. Kings did not summon commoners for pleasant conversation. She assumed she was to be interrogated. Perhaps he regretted giving her the cloak. Perhaps the council had demanded her execution for slowing the march. She nodded silently. She pulled the heavy fur tightly around her shoulders. She followed the soldier through the knee-deep snow. Her legs trembled at every step. The wind howled through the pine branches, sounding like a warning. The guard stopped outside the massive command tent. He lifted the canvas flap. He gestured for her to enter. Chloe took a deep breath. preparing herself for the worst. She stepped inside. The air in the tent was remarkably warm. A large iron brazier burned brightly in the center. It cast a golden light over the tactical maps and armor stands. The noise of the storm was muffled here. Charles sat in a high-backed chair near the fire. He had removed his iron armor. He wore a simple dark tunic. The lack of armor made him look even broader. He stared into the flames. He looked drained. Chloe stood near the entrance. She kept her head lowered. She waited for a command. She barely dared to breathe. "Come closer to the fire," Charles said. He did not turn his head. He gestured toward a wooden stool opposite his chair. "You will freeze by the door." Chloe hesitated. She moved slowly across the woven rugs. She sat on the edge of the stool. She kept her eyes on the burning coals. The crackling wood was the only sound between them. Charles watched her. He noted the dark soot clinging to her cheek. He saw how the oversized cloak draped over her small frame. It was a bizarre sight in a war camp, yet it but a strange sense of calm to his racing mind. "What is your name?" he asked. His tone was gentle. "Chloe, my lord," she answered softly. "The old man," Charles continued. "Is he alive?" Chloe looked up in surprise. She nodded quickly. "Yes, my lord. He is resting. Thank you for sparing him." Charles leaned back in his chair. "Why did you risk your life for him? He is not your blood."
Chloe looked at her hands. "He is my neighbor. When my parents died of the winter sickness, he gave me bread. He kept me alive. I could not watch him die." Charles stared at her. Such simple loyalty was foreign to him. In his world, loyalty was bought with gold or secured by fear. The concept of risking death for a loaf of past bread puzzled him. It fascinated him. Silence returned to the tent. Chloe watched him flex his right hand. He had removed his gauntlets. His knuckles were raw and split. Dried blood stained his skin. It was a stark reminder of the violence he commanded. She remembered how his gloved hand had felt under her touch. She looked at a brass basin resting on a side table. Steam rose from the fresh water inside it. A clean linen cloth sat beside the basin. Before she could overthink her actions, Chloe stood up. She walked to the table. She dipped the cloth into the warm water. She wrung it out carefully. She returned to the fire and stood beside his chair. Charles looked at her. He did not speak. He watched her raise the damp cloth. He could have stopped her with a single word. He did not.
"May I?"
Chloe whispered. Her voice carried a faint tremor. Charles kept his gaze locked on her face. Slowly, he extended his right hand toward her. Chloe gently cradled his hand. His skin was rough with calluses and scars. His hand was large enough to crush hers effortlessly. She pressed the warm linen against his knuckles. She wiped away the dried blood with methodical care. She moved her fingers with a feather-light touch. She traced the lines of his palm, cleaning the grime of battle. Her touch was hesitant, but tender. The warmth of the water seeped into his tired joints. Charles felt the steady rhythm of her breathing. He studied the soft curve of her jaw. He watched the earnest focus in her blue eyes. No one had touched him with such gentleness in a decade. He was accustomed to the clash of steel and the grip of desperate enemies. He was used to assassins and traitors. This quiet devotion felt like a forgotten magic. He felt a strange tightening in his chest. He wanted to lean forward. He wanted to press his face against her shoulder and sleep. He suppressed the instinct, holding himself perfectly still. He dared not frighten her away. Chloe finished cleaning his hand. She lowered the cloth. She kept her fingers resting lightly against his palm for a lingering second. She looked up, meeting his amber gaze. The air between them grew dense. Unspoken words hung in the silence. The heavy burden of his crown seemed to fade in the glow of the firelight. For a fleeting moment, he was not the sovereign of Acadia. He was just a tired man, seeking warmth. "Thank you, Chloe," Charles murmured. His voice was a low rumble. Chloe offered a small, shy smile. She started to pull her hand away. Before she could retreat, Charles turned his hand. He gently caught her fingers in his own. He did not grip them tightly. He simply held them, anchoring her to the moment. Chloe froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at his hand holding hers. A flush of heat rushed to her cheeks. She did not try to pull away. The wind howled outside, beating against the canvas. The fire crackled in the brazier. The peace inside the tent felt like a fragile dream. Suddenly, a sharp shadow told across the illuminated canvas of the tent wall. It moved too fast to be a royal guard. Charles reacted instantly. His amber eyes darkened. He released her hand and stood up in a single fluid motion. He pushed Chloe behind him, shielding her with his body. Before she could ask what was wrong, the heavy fabric of the tent ripped open. The cold wind rushed inside, carrying the gleam of an assassin's steel blade. The assassin lunged through the torn canvas. Steel gleamed in the dim light of the brazier. Charles moved faster than the eye could track. He did not reach for his heavy broadsword resting near the map table. Instead, he pivoted on his heel and seized the attacker's wrist. A sharp crack echoed in the warm tent. The assassin dropped the dagger with a muffled groan. Charles delivered a swift strike to the man's chest, sending him crashing into the central pole. The wooden structure groaned under the impact. Chloe stumbled backward. Her hands flew to her mouth. She pressed her back against the command table. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Before she could process the violence, a dozen flaming arrows pierced the canvas roof. The dry fabric ignited instantly. Fire raced along the seams, turning the tent into a burning cage. Smoke rapidly filled the enclosed space. The wind howled outside, feeding the hum of the flames. "Stay behind me," Charles commanded over the roar of the fire. He grabbed his longsword from the armor stand. He did not have time to don his iron plates. He wore only his dark tunic and heavy leather boots. He kicked the smoldering canvas aside, clearing a path into the winter night. The war camp had descended into absolute chaos. Enemy soldiers had bypassed the vanguard sentries under the cover of the blizzard. Swords clashed in the darkness. Shouts of panic and orders mixed with the shrieking wind. Tents burned like bright beacons in the snow. Charles stepped into the freezing storm. He kept Chloe close to his back. The heat of the burning command tent clashed with the biting frost. 2 enemy warriors spotted the king. They charged forward with raised axes, their faces twisted in fury. Charles met their charge without hesitation. His blade moved in a fluid, lethal arc. He struck the first warrior down with a heavy blow. The second attacker hesitated, recognizing the amber gaze of the Akkadian sovereign. That momentary fear was his undoing. Charles disarmed him in a single motion. "Move!" Charles yelled to Chloe, grabbing her arm. They rushed through the snow-choked camp. Burning debris rained down around them. The heavy wolf fur cloak shielded Chloe from the falling embers. She struggled to keep up with his long strides. Her boots slipped constantly on the icy mud. A burning supply wagon collapsed nearby. It sent a shower of sparks into the air. Startled horses reared and kicked, breaking their tethers. The terrified animals stamped through the skirmish, scattering men from both sides. The sudden stampede forced Charles and Chloe apart. A massive warhorse crashed between them. Chloe fell backward into the snow. The thick fur cloak cushioned her fall, but the breath left her lungs in a sharp gasp. She looked up through the smoke. Enemy soldiers were closing in on the isolated command area. Charles was fighting 3 men at once a few paces away. He moved with a terrifying grace, pushing them back with sheer strength. Panic seized Chloe's chest. The noise of the battle was deafening. She felt frail amidst the clashing steel and roaring flames. She scrabbled to her feet, ignoring the stinging pain in her knees. She lunged toward the king, dodging a falling wooden beam. Charles dispatched the last attacker. He turned, searching for her in the smoke. His amber eyes locked onto her trembling form. He reached out his hand, his large fingers coated in ash. Chloe grabbed his hand with both of hers. Her grip was desperate, her knuckles turning white. She pressed her cold face against his arm. "Don't let go of my hand," Chloe begged, her voice cracked with terror. "Please, Charles, don't let go." She had used his given name. It slipped past her lips in a moment of pure instinct. For the second time that night, the king froze. No one called him by his birth name. He was the sovereign, the warlord. He looked down at the young woman clinging to his arm. She was shaking. Her plea echoed louder in his mind than the clashing swords around them. Something ancient and protective snapped awake within his chest. Standard royal protocol dictated that the sovereign must retreat immediately. General Torrin was shouting for the king to fall back. A wall of shields was forming near the medical wagons, designed to protect the commander at all costs. Charles ignored the shouts. He looked at the shield wall, then looked at the flames cutting off their path to the main force. Moving toward the guards meant dragging Chloe through the thickest part of the melee. She would not survive the crush of armored bodies. He made his choice. Charles tightened his grip on her hand. He pulled her close. Before she could react, he wrapped his left arm around her waist. He lifted her off the freezing ground in one smooth motion. He held her securely against his chest, cradling her as if she were made of glass. Chloe gasped. She instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck. She buried her face into his shoulder. The scent of leather and pine anchored her in the chaos. His body was a solid fortress of heat and muscle against the freezing storm. "I will never let you go," Charles murmured against her hair. His voice was a low, fierce vow. He tightened his hold on his broadsword. He turned his back on the Acadian shield wall. He faced the dark tree line of the Shenandoah woods. A dozen enemy skirmishers blocked the path, their weapons drawn. They saw the Acadian king holding a woman in his arms. They assumed he was vulnerable. They charged forward, eager to claim the ultimate prize. They were wrong. Charles moved like a dark storm. He fought with one hand, his blade striking with devastating precision. He did not parry, he shattered. His strength was born of a singular, terrifying focus. He was no longer fighting to win a war. He was fighting to protect the fragile life resting against his heart.
Enemy soldiers fell back. Their morale broke under his relentless advance. They had heard tales of his wrath, and now they witnessed it. He cut a path through the ambush with grim efficiency. He did not slow his pace, not even when a stray arrow grazed his shoulder. He carried Chloe past the burning perimeter of the camp. The noise of the battle began to fade behind them. It was swallowed by the roaring wind. The snow grew deeper as they entered the dense pine forest. The towering trees blocked the moonlight, plunging them into heavy darkness. Charles did not stop. He navigated the treacherous terrain with unnatural certainty. He knew the enemy would send trackers once the camp was secured. He needed to put distance between them and the slaughter. Chloe kept her eyes closed. She listened to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his tunic. It was a comforting drum that drowned out her fear. She felt the flex of his muscles as he carried her effortlessly through the snow. Hours seemed to pass. The storm worsened, erasing their tracks within minutes. The cold was unbearable, yet Chloe felt safe wrapped in his arms and his heavy cloak. She finally found the courage to look up. His jaw was set in a rigid line. Snow gathered in his dark hair. His amber eyes scanned the shadows, alert to any danger. He showed no signs of fatigue, though he had been carrying her for miles. "My lord," Chloe whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the wind. "You should put me down. I can walk. You will exhaust yourself." Charles did not look down. He adjusted his grip, pulling her even closer to his chest. "Rest, Chloe," he commanded softly. "We have a long way to go." He stepped over a fallen log, pushing deeper into the untamed wilderness. The Acadian king had abandoned his army, his council, and his throne. He had traded his empire for the dark woods, simply because a young woman had asked him to hold her hand. The dark pines loomed overhead like silent sentries. Their thick branches offered some refuge from the falling snow, but the wind continued to bite. Charles knew these woods well. He had hunted in similar terrain during his youth, long before the heavy crown was placed upon his brow. He focused on finding a natural shelter. The temperature was dropping fast. Even with his endurance, they could not survive the night exposed to the elements. He scanned the rocky outcrops along the ridge. Chloe shifted slightly in his arms. Her fingers were still tightly woven into the fabric of his tunic. She felt a subtle hitch in his breathing.
She noticed a dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his left arm. The arrow that grazed him during the escape had cut deeper than he let on. "You are bleeding," she said, her eyes widening in alarm. She reached out to touch his sleeve. "It is nothing," Charles replied evenly. He stepped carefully down a steep incline. "A scratch." "It is not a scratch," Chloe insisted. Her voice trembled again. "You are hurt because of me. You should have stayed with the vanguard." Charles stopped walking. He stood in the shadow of a massive rock formation. He finally looked down at her. His amber eyes were intense in the gloom. The icy wind swirled around them, but the space between their faces felt strangely warm. "If I had stayed with the vanguard," Charles said slowly, "you would be dead in the mud. I do not regret my choice." He resumed walking before she could formulate a response. His words echoed in her mind. A king did not risk his life for a commoner. A warlord did not abandon his post for a peasant. Yet, he had done exactly that. They found a shallow cave hidden behind a dense thicket of frosted briars. It was small, barely large enough for two people, but it was dry. The stone walls would block the wind. Charles carefully lowered Chloe to the ground. Her legs were numb from the cold and the lack of movement. She stumbled, her knees buckling. Charles caught her immediately, supporting her weight until she found her balance. He gestured toward the back of the small cave. "Sit there. Keep the cloak wrapped tight." Chloe obeyed in silence. She huddled against the cold stone, watching him move. He did not rest. He gathered dry moss and dead branches from the entrance of the cave. He worked with methodical efficiency, ignoring the bleeding wound on his arm. He was a man built for survival. The regal aura of the king had faded, replaced by the primal grace of a protector. Chloe watched the firelight spark from his flint. A small flame caught the dry moss. Light filled the tiny cave, pushing back the oppressive darkness. Charles sat down near the fire, facing the entrance. He kept his broadsword resting across his knees. He was guarding the door. He was guarding her. But the dark stain on his sleeve continued to grow, a silent threat in the quiet night. The storm broke just before dawn. Pale winter sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of the Shenandoah pines, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Inside the shallow cave, the small fire had burned down to glowing red embers. The wind no longer howled, leaving behind a heavy, ringing silence in the forest. Chloe woke to the smell of wood smoke and damp stone. She was cocooned safely in the heavy wolf fur cloak. She sat up slowly, brushing the sleep from her eyes. Charles was exactly where he had been hours ago. He sat near the cave entrance with his back to her. His broadsword rested across his knees. He stared out into the quiet, snow-draped forest. He had not slept a single moment. "You are awake," Charles said quietly. He did not turn his head. His amber eyes continued to scan the distant tree line for any sign of movement. "You stayed awake all night," Chloe replied. She pulled the cloak tighter around her shoulders, shivering as the morning air hit her face. "You must be exhausted." "I have gone longer without rest," he answered simply. His voice was steady, giving no hint of fatigue. Chloe looked at his left arm. The dark stain on his sleeve had dried during the night, stiffening the fabric of his tunic. The reality of their situation pressed down on her chest. They were lost in the freezing wilderness. They had no supplies, no horses, and no reinforcements. The Akkadian king was injured, and he had abandoned his entire army for her sake. In the capital, a commoner like her would never be permitted to speak to him without bowing her head to the stone floor. Anyone who dared to look the Alpha King in the eye was usually whipped or executed. Here, in the quiet isolation of the winter woods, the rigid laws of the court felt distant. The invisible walls of rank and power had dissolved in the snow. They were just a man and a woman trying to survive the morning. Chloe stood up. She carefully folded his heavy cloak and set it on a dry patch of stone near the embers. The cold air stung her skin immediately, but she ignored the discomfort. She walked toward the entrance of the cave. Charles shifted his grip on his broadsword. "Stay inside, trackers might be near." "I am not going far," Chloe said. She pointed toward a cluster of frost-covered rocks just outside the cave. "I need to gather clean snow for water, and your wound needs attention. If it festers, your strength will fail, and we will both die here." Charles looked at her. He was accustomed to giving absolute orders, not receiving instructions from a village woman. Yet, her voice was steady and practical. It lacked the trembling fear she had shown during the ambush. The wilderness was her element. She had survived years of hardship and starvation, learning how to glean life from the unforgiving earth. He gave a slow nod, lowering his blade slightly. "Do not leave my line of sight." Chloe stepped into the freezing air. The snow was knee-deep and difficult to navigate. She found a large, curved piece of bark near a fallen oak tree. She gathered clean, untouched snow into the bark. She then moved toward a patch of green showing through the white blanket near the base of the rocks. She knelt in the snow, brushing aside the heavy frost with her bare hands to reveal a cluster of dark ferns and pale, twisted roots. She recognized the plants instantly. Her mother had taught her how to find winter fennel and white willow bark long before the winter sickness took her family. Royal soldiers considered these plants common weeds, but to a village healer they were essential tools for drawing out infection and stopping fevers. Charles watched her movements from the shadows of the cave. He noted the efficient, practiced way she worked. She did not hesitate or complain about the biting cold. She gathered the roots with careful hands, ensuring she did not damage the stems. A quiet admiration replaced his initial wariness. His generals knew how to conquer walled cities and command thousands of men, but none of them knew how to survive in the dirt without a massive supply train. She possessed a different kind of strength, a quiet, enduring resilience. Chloe returned to the cave. Her fingers were bright red from the frost. She set the bark near the glowing embers to melt the snow into usable water. She then sat on a flat stone near the fire and began crushing the leaves and roots together using a smooth, heavy rock. A sharp, earthy scent filled the small space, cutting through the smell of smoke. Charles watched her work in silence. The rhythmic sound of the stone grinding against the roots was strangely calming. "Take off your tunic," Chloe said. She kept her eyes focused on grinding the herbs into a thick green paste.
Charles raised an eyebrow. The command was spoken with casual authority. He reached across his chest and unlaced the leather ties of his dark tunic. He pulled the heavy garment over his head, wincing slightly as the stiff fabric peeled away from the dried wound on his shoulder. Chloe looked up and froze. His chest and shoulders were heavily scarred. The pale marks formed a silent, brutal map of 100 battles and countless betrayals. The sheer size and muscular power of his frame were intimidating in the confined space of the cave. Yet, her gaze was quickly drawn to the angry red gash on his upper arm. The arrow had torn deep into the muscle, and the edges of the wound looked inflamed. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. She moved closer to him, bringing the crushed herbs and the melted snow water. "This will sting," Chloe warned softly. She dipped a torn strip of her own woolen shawl into the cold water. She gently pressed it against his arm, washing away the dried blood with methodical care. Charles did not flinch. His breathing remained perfectly even. He watched her face as she worked. She was so close that he could feel the faint warmth of her breath against his bare skin. She applied the green herbal paste directly to the open wound. The sting was sharp and immediate, but Charles barely noticed the physical pain. His attention was entirely anchored on the gentle touch of her fingers. She worked with a delicate, deliberate care that stood in stark contrast to the brutal violence he experienced every day. "Why do you know this?" Charles asked. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet cave. Chloe carefully bound the wound with another strip of clean wool, tying it securely. "When you have no gold for a physician, you learn what the forest provides. The earth gives us what we need, if we know where to look." "The earth gives nothing freely," Charles countered softly, his worldview shaped by endless warfare. "It must be taken by force, or it is lost." "Perhaps that is true for kings," Chloe whispered. She finished tying the crude bandage and looked up, meeting his amber eyes. "But for the rest of us, we simply learn to ask, and we share what we find." The space between them crackled with an unspoken tension. Her hand still rested lightly against his bare arm. He did not pull away. The rigid walls of isolation he had built around his heart over the past decade were slowly crumbling. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to raise his hand. He wanted to trace the soft line of her cheek. He wanted to wipe away the faint smudge of dirt near her left eye. He wanted to pull her against his chest and simply rest. Before he could move, a sudden tremor shook his chest. Charles drew in a sharp, ragged breath. He squeezed his eyes shut, his muscles locked in a spasm of intense, blinding pain. The heat of the small fire suddenly felt like a roaring furnace. "Charles," Chloe asked, her voice laced with immediate alarm,
She felt a sudden, unnatural heat radiating from his bare skin beneath her fingers. He forced his eyes open. The rich amber color was clouded and unfocused. A web of dark, unnatural veins was beginning to spread from the edge of the bandage, creeping aggressively toward his neck and chest. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. He felt a cold numbness spreading down his left side. "The arrow," Charles gritted out. His voice was strained, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. He reached blindly for the hilt of his broadsword with his right hand. His combat instincts fought a desperate losing battle against his failing body. He tried to stand, driven by the primal urge to secure the cave entrance and protect her. His legs refused to hold his massive weight. The stone walls of the cave spun violently around him. "No! Stay still!" Chloe cried out. She dropped the remaining herbs on the stone floor. She grabbed his broad shoulders, trying to push him back down to the ground. It was useless. The immense strength that had carried them both through the blizzard was gone. The assassin's blade had not just been forged steel. The weapon had been coated in something treacherous and fast-acting. Charles collapsed forward. His heavy frame crashed against the stone floor. The broadsword slipped from his numb fingers, clattering loudly in the silent cave. He lay motionless in the dust, the hidden poison finally bringing the unstoppable king to his knees. Charles lay motionless on the stone floor. The heavy thud of his fall echoed in the quiet cave. Chloe dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands shook as she pressed her fingers against his neck. His pulse was weak and erratic. The dark veins spreading across his chest confirmed her worst fear. The arrow had carried night viper venom. It was a treacherous weapon used by assassins to ensure death even from a minor scratch. The poison attacked the heart and froze the blood. Left untreated, it killed within hours. The victim would simply fall into a deep sleep and never wake. She had seen hunters die from it in her village. The only cure was time, continuous heat, and a relentless will to survive. Chloe refused to panic. The harsh reality of her past took over. She dragged his heavy frame closer to the fire, struggling under his immense weight. She managed to position him near the glowing coals. She grabbed the wolf fur cloak and draped it securely over his shivering body. She added the last pieces of dry wood to the fire, coaxing the flames higher against the stone wall. The first night was a brutal test of endurance. The winter wind returned, howling outside the shallow entrance. Charles burned with a terrible fever. Sweat beaded on his forehead, yet his skin felt like ice. He muttered disjointed commands in the dark, fighting phantom battles in his delirium. His broad frame convulsed with sudden pain, nearly throwing off the fur. The physical toll of the poison was horrifying to witness. He was a man built of iron and discipline, reduced to shivering agony by a single drop of venom. Chloe knelt beside him without rest. She used the damp linen cloth to wipe his brow. She squeezed drops of melted snow into his dry mouth to keep him hydrated. When he thrashed, she held his shoulders down with all her meager strength. She spoke to him in a soft voice, telling him stories of her childhood to anchor his wandering mind. She could have run away. The king was defenseless. The path back to the valley was frozen but passable. No one would ever know. She could vanish into the mountains and start a new life away from the brutal Acadian laws. The thought never crossed her mind. He had risked his reign to pull her from the fire. He had carried her through the storm when he should have saved himself. She would not abandon him to the cold. By the dawn of the second day, the fever finally broke. The dark veins on his chest stopped spreading. However, a new danger quickly emerged. The poison left his body drained of all natural heat. The fire dwindled to mere embers. Chloe had no more dry wood to burn. The temperature inside the cave plummeted dangerously. Charles began to shake violently. His lips turned a pale shade of blue. The heavy cloak was not enough to combat the freezing air. Chloe knew the frost would stop his weakened heart if she did not act quickly. She removed her torn shawl and set it aside on the dust. She slid under the heavy cloak, lying directly beside him on the hard stone. She pressed her side against his chest, wrapping her arms around his torso. She shared her own body heat, burying her face into the crook of his neck. His skin was dangerously cold. She closed her eyes and prayed to the silent forest, willing her heart to beat for them both. The stone floor leached the heat from her bones. Every hour felt like an eternity in the pitch-black darkness. She whispered promises she didn't know she could keep, telling him to hold on to the light. The second night blinded into a hazy dream of exhaustion. Chloe did not move. She maintained her firm hold on him, listening to the shallow rhythm of his breathing. Her own energy faded as the frost crept closer to the cave entrance. Her limbs grew heavy and numb. She drifted into a restless sleep, anchored only by the solid weight of his body beneath the fur. Charles woke to a dull ache in his chest. His eyelids felt heavy. He opened them slowly, greeted by the dim light of early morning. The air was freezing, but a steady warmth enveloped his left side. He lay still, letting his clouded mind process his surroundings. The memory of the ambush rushed back, followed by the blinding pain of the poison. He expected to find himself alone. He expected to find death. Instead, he felt a soft weight resting against his ribs. He turned his head slightly. Chloe lay asleep beside him. She was curled against his side, her arms wrapped firmly around his waist. Her dark hair spilled over his shoulder. Her face was pale from sheer exhaustion, and her breathing was fragile. They were trapped together beneath his cloak. Charles stared at her in quiet disbelief. He was the most feared warlord in Acadia. His enemies plighted his demise daily. His own council feared his shadow, yet this woman had stayed by his side in the unforgiving wilderness. She had sought death itself to keep him breathing. She asked for no gold, no titles, and no lands. She simply gave everything she had.
He noticed her discarded shawl lying near the dead ashes. She had stripped away her only meager protection against the winter. She had risked freezing to death just to preserve his core heat. He felt a profound shift within his soul. The endless rage and calculated cruelty that defined his reign felt distant. The dark void in his chest, hollowed out by a decade of war, was washed away by the simple devotion of her presence. He did not want to conquer cities in this moment. He merely wanted to keep her safe. Carefully, Charles raised his right hand. His muscles protested with a dull ache, but he ignored the pain. He reached across his chest and brushed a stray lock of hair away from her face. His calloused fingers traced the soft curve of her cheek. It was a gesture of unspoken reverence. Chloe stirred at his touch. Her blue eyes fluttered open. She blinked against the dim light, her gaze focusing on his face. She saw that his amber eyes were clear. The dark fog of the poison had lifted. A wave of profound relief washed over her tired features. "You are awake," Chloe whispered. Her voice was raspy from the cold. "You stayed," Charles replied softly. His voice was a deep rumble. He did not pull his hand away from her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin with a tenderness he did not know he possessed. "You saved my life." Chloe offered a faint smile. She rested her cheek against his palm, leaning into his touch. The barrier between them was gone. There was no king and commoner in the silent cave. There was only a man who had fought a war for her, and a woman who had given him her warmth. A sudden crunch of snow outside shattered the peace. Charles tensed instantly. The gentle warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by the lethal instincts of a predator. He shifted his body, moving Chloe behind him. He reached for his broadsword lying on the stone floor, his grip tightening around the leather hilt. Heavy boots marched toward the cave entrance. The silhouette of an armored man appeared in the morning light, followed by 3 others. It was General Torrin, flanked by the elite guard. The Acadian search party had finally tracked them through the snow. Torrin stepped into the cave. His eyes scanned the dead embers and the king rising from the ground. Then, his hard gaze locked onto Chloe huddled under the fur cloak. Instead of kneeling in relief, the general drew his steel longsword. The sharp sound of blades leaving their scabbards echoed off the stone walls. The guards followed his lead, pointing their weapons directly at Chloe. "Seize the spy," Torrin commanded harshly, his voice cutting through the freezing air. She signaled the ambush and led the king into a trap. She used her peasant guise to lower his guard. "Execute her immediately." The sound of drawn steel hung in the freezing air of the cave. General Torrin kept his sword leveled at Chloe. His elite guards mirrored the stance, forming a tight semicircle of lethal intent. They saw a village woman who had somehow survived an ambush that scattered the vanguard. To their military minds, her survival was proof of treason. Charles did not reach for his weapon. He simply stepped in front of Chloe, shielding her with his broad frame. His fever had broken, but the poison still left him pale and physically drained. Yet, as he looked at Torrin, the air in the cave drew thick with suffocating pressure.
Lower your steel, Torin, Charles commanded softly. His voice lacked its usual booming resonance, but it carried a deadly edge. My lord, she led you into a trap, Torin argued, his eyes darting to the dead embers. The enemy knew our exact location. She is a spy. Akkadian law demands her immediate execution. I am the law, Charles replied. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the general. And I gave you a direct order. Sheath your sword. Torin hesitated. He looked at the king, noting the dark stain of blood on his tunic and the faint tremor in his hands. The warlord was injured and vulnerable. For a fraction of a second, treason flared in the general's eyes. Then, Charles locked his amber gaze onto Torin, radiating a cold, ancient authority that promised absolute ruin. Torin brent the eye contact. He slowly slid his blade back into its scabbard. The elite guards followed suit, stepping back nervously. Prepare the horses, Charles ordered. He turned his back on the soldiers, offering them a display of ultimate confidence. We ride for the Iron Keep. The journey to the reclaimed border keep took hours through the deep snow. The temporary Akkadian stronghold sat atop a jagged cliff, its stone walls towering over the valley. When they arrived, royal physicians rotted to attend to Charles. The king was ushered away to purge the remaining venom from his blood.
Torin seized the opportunity. Acting under the guise of military security, the general ordered his men to separate Chloe from the king's guard. She was dragged into the lower levels of the keep. They locked her in a cold holding cell without food or a fire. Chloe sat on the stone floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. She did not weep. The memory of the cave kept her warm. She remembered the gentle touch of his calloused fingers against her cheek. She knew Torin wanted to use her death to prove a point, but she trusted Charles. Hours passed in the gloom. Just before sunset, the heavy wooden door of her cell swung open. 2 armored guards marched inside. They grabbed her arms and hauled her to her feet, offering no explanation. They dragged her up the winding stone stairs toward the main hall. The great hall was illuminated by iron torches burning along the walls. The flickering light cast long shadows over the long council table. The highest-ranking generals and lords of the Akkadian army stood around it. They wore their ceremonial armor, their faces fixed in grim determination. At the far end of the hall sat Charles. He rested on a high wooden chair that served as a makeshift throne. He wore a fresh black tunic, his broadsword resting against the armrest. His face was unreadable. The guards forced Chloe to her knees in the center of the room. The cold stone bit into her skin. She kept her head up, refusing to shrink under the hateful stares of the council members. General Torin stepped forward, taking the center floor. He addressed the king, but his voice echoed loud enough for the entire hall to hear. My lord, the enemy forces are gathering in the valley, Torin began, pointing toward the heavy wooden doors. They believe Akkadia is weak. They believe our sovereign has lost his ruthless edge. They whisper that you abandoned your army for a peasant girl. Charles rested his chin on his knuckles. He watched Torin without blinking. He did not interrupt the general's speech. Our empire is built on fear and discipline, Torin continued, his voice rising in volume. Mercy is a luxury we cannot afford in winter. This woman brought disorder to the vanguard. She distracted the crown during a critical ambush. She is a poison to our morale. The other generals murmured in agreement. They were men hardened by endless campaigns. They did not understand the quiet warmth that had passed between the king and the commoner in the cave. They only saw a threat to their military structure. If we let her live, we show the enemy that we are soft, Torin declared. He turned to look at Chloe with open disgust. The council demands her execution before the sun sets. We must restore the fear that keeps Akkadia strong. Silence fell over the great hall. The crackling of the torches was the only sound. Everyone waited for the Alpha King to speak. They expected him to nod, to wave his hand, and to send the girl to the executioner's block. It was what he had done 100 times before. Chloe did not look at Torin. She did not look at the angry generals calling for her blood. She lifted her chin and looked directly at Charles. Her blue eyes were clear and steady. She offered no defense. She did not beg for her life or scream for mercy. She simply looked at him with an absolute, unwavering trust. She saw past the terrifying warlord on the throne. She saw the man who had let her clean his wounds, the man who had traded his warmth to keep her alive. Charles felt the weight of her gaze.
It pierced through the heavy political maneuvering of the council. He looked at her kneeling on the cold stone, surrounded by men who wanted to tear her apart. He remembered the desperate strength in her small hands when she had begged him to spare the old baker. He saw Torrhen step closer to Chloe, resting his hand on his weapon. The general was pushing his authority, testing the boundaries of the king's patience. "Give the order, my lord," Torrhen urged. "Let us be done with this distraction." Charles closed his eyes for a brief second. The lingering ache of the venom was still present in his chest, but a different kind of fire ignited in his blood. It was a cold, terrifying wrath. He opened his eyes. The amber hue burned with intense, focused fury. He slowly stood up from the throne. The movement was unhurried, yet it commanded the immediate attention of every man in the room. The murmurs died instantly. The generals stiffened, suddenly remembering the lethal nature of the man they served. The air in the hall turned heavy and oppressive. Charles stepped down from the raised platform. He did not speak. His silence was a physical weight that pressed down on Torrhen's shoulders. The general took a hesitant step backward, his confidence faltering under the king's gaze. Charles walked past the council members. He stopped a few paces away from Chloe. He looked down at her, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, meant only for her to see. Then he turned his massive frame to face Torrhen and the council. He reached down and grabbed the leather hilt of his broadsword. The sound of the heavy steel leaving its scabbard rang through the hall like a death knell. It was a harsh, metallic scream that made the seasoned generals flinch. The blade was almost as tall as a man, forged from dark steel and designed to cleave through armor. Torrhen swallowed hard, his face turning pale. He assumed the king was going to execute the girl himself to prove his ruthlessness. Charles gripped the hilt with both hands. He raised the massive blade, the torchlight reflecting off the dark steel. The council watched in breathless anticipation, waiting for the execution to begin. The massive blade arced through the dim light of the great hall. The steel whistled, a sharp intake of breath before the kill. General Torrhen smirked, anticipating the familiar spray of blood that would restore the brutal order of the Acadian military. The broadsword did not strike the stone floor. It did not touch Chloe. Charles pivoted his shoulders at the last fraction of a second. He brought the dark steel crashing down onto the center of the heavy oak council table. The impact sounded like a thunderclap. Solid wood splintered violently, sending jagged fragments flying across the room. The thick table snapped in half under his terrifying strength, collapsing inward with a deafening groan. The council members jumped back in shock. Torrhen stumbled over his own boots, his smug expression vanishing into wide-eyed terror. Charles stood amidst the ruined wood. He held the hilt of his embedded sword with both hands. His breathing was slow and measured. The amber fire in his eyes promised death to anyone who dared to move. "My reign is built on my strength, Torrhen," Charles said softly, his voice carried into every shadowed corner of the silent hall. "Not on the blood of the innocent, not on the sacrifice of those I choose to protect." He released the sword hilt. He walked over to where Chloe still knelt on the stone. He extended his right hand toward her. Chloe looked at his hand, then up at his face. She placed her fingers in his palm. Charles wrapped his hand around hers and gently pulled her to her feet. He kept her standing close to his side, facing the terrified council. "Hear my words and burn them into your minds," Charles commanded. "This woman is under my absolute protection. She is the shield that kept your king breathing in the dark. Her life is my life. Anyone who questions her presence, anyone who disrespects her name or draws steel in her direction, will face my blade." He looked directly at the trembling general. "Is that understood, Torrhen?" Torrhen fell to his knees. The other commanders immediately followed, bowing their heads toward the cold stone floor. "Yes, my lord," they echoed in unison. Their voices trembled with genuine fear. The ruthless sovereign they knew had not disappeared. His wrath had simply found a new, terrifying focus. Charles did not spare them another glance. He kept his hand firmly wrapped around Chloe's fingers and led her out of the ruined hall. Later that night, the Iron Keep settled into an uneasy silence. Chloe waited in the sovereign's private chambers. The room was stark but warm, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A soft woolen blanket rested in a heavy bed, but she chose to sit on a low stool near the hearth. She stared at the crackling flames. Her mind replayed the violence of the council room. He had shattered his own table to protect her. He had threatened his highest generals for her sake. The Alpha King had drawn a line in the sand, and he had placed her safely behind it. The heavy oak door creaked open. Charles stepped inside. He had removed his iron pauldrons and his weapons. He wore a simple linen shirt and dark trousers. The exhaustion he hid from his soldiers was plain on his face. The poison had taken a severe physical toll, and the political confrontation had drained his remaining energy. He closed the door and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. The loud click echoed through the room, sealing them off from the brutal world outside. Charles walked toward the fire. He did not sit in the large armchair reserved for him. Instead, he stopped directly in front of Chloe. He looked down at her, his amber eyes reflecting the soft, warm light of the hearth. The heavy silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken truths. Slowly, the most feared man in Acadia lowered his massive frame. He dropped to one knee on the woven rug, positioning himself beneath her gaze. Chloe gasped softly. Her hands rested nervously in her lap. A king kneeled for no one. To bow was a sign of submission, a fatal weakness in his world. Yet here he was, surrendering his height and his authority in the quiet intimacy of the firelight. Charles reached out and gently took her hands. His calloused thumbs traced the delicate bones of her knuckles. He bowed his head, resting his forehead against her fingertips. "I am tired, Chloe," Charles whispered. The confession carried the weight of a decade of warfare. "I have lived in the ash and the blood for so long. I forgot what it felt like to be a man. I forgot what it meant to feel warm." Chloe shifted on her stool. She slipped one hand free from his grip and reached forward. She brushed her fingers through his dark hair, offering a silent, soothing comfort. Charles closed his eyes, leaning heavily into her touch. "Torrin was right about one thing," Charles continued, his voice barely a rough murmur. "I am distracted. My enemies look at me and see a warlord who has lost his edge. But they do not understand. You did not weaken me. You gave me a reason to survive." He lifted his head, meeting her blue eyes. The fierce predator was gone. Only a deep, raw devotion remained. "I swore I would never let go of your hand," he vowed, his gaze burning with quiet intensity. "I will keep that promise until my last breath. You are my peace." Chloe felt tears welling in her eyes. She leaned forward, bridging the small gap between them. She pressed her forehead against his. They stayed like that in the quiet room, sharing the warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of their breathing. There was no need for grand declarations. The quiet devotion passing between them was stronger than any iron armor. The peace ended with the dawn. Harsh war horns shattered the morning silence. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the keep, demanding blood and steel. The enemy forces had massed in the lower valley, daring the Acadian army to break their lines. Charles stood near the heavy wooden door of the chamber. He was fully armored in black iron once again. The wolf fur cloak rested over his broad shoulders. He looked imposing, a living weapon ready to be unleashed upon the valley. Chloe stood a few paces away, her heart hammered with sudden dread. "I must lead the vanguard," Charles stated. His tone was professional, returning to the role of the sovereign commander. "The enemy stronghold must fall today, or the winter will starve us out." "Let me come with you," Chloe urged, stepping forward. "No," Charles raised a gloved hand. "The battlefield is no place for you. You will stay here, in the highest tower of the Iron Keep. It is the safest place in the region. I am leaving my personal shadow guard to watch the doors. No one enters." He closed the distance between them. He cupped her face in his steel gauntlets, his touch incredibly gentle despite the cold metal. "Wait for me," Charles commanded softly. "I will," Chloe promised. He turned and walked out the door. The heavy wood slammed shut, followed by the sound of the iron bolt locking from the outside. She was safe, sealed within the impenetrable fortress. Hours crawled by. Chloe paced the stone floor of the high tower. She listened to the distant rumble of marching boots and the fading calls of the cavalry. The Acadian army was moving out, stretching down the mountain pass to meet the enemy. She walked to the narrow, arched window. The sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of more snow. She watched the black banners of Acadia disappear into the foggy valley below. Charles was riding into the teeth of the enemy defenses. A strange unease settled in her stomach. The fortress felt too quiet. Most of the garrison had marched with the king. She shifted her gaze away from the valley, looking toward the jagged ridges to the north. The wind whipped her dark hair around her face. Her breath caught in her throat. Thick black smoke was rising from the northern watchtowers. It was not a signal fire. It was the heavy, greasy smoke of burning structures. A chilling realization struck her. The enemy force in the valley was a decoy. The main opposing army had bypassed the Acadian vanguard during the night, using the mountain trails. They were not defending their own stronghold. They were marching directly on the Iron Keep. Down below, in the courtyard, the alarm bells began to shriek. The few remaining defenders shouted in sudden panic. Charles was miles away, charging into a massive trap, and the true threat was already battering the gates of her sanctuary.
The heavy thud of the battering ram shook the foundations of the Iron Keep. Dust drifted from the arched stone ceiling, settling onto Chloe's shoulders. She stood by the narrow tower window, watching the sea of enemy soldiers flood the lower courtyard. The decoy tactic had worked as intended. The Acadian garrison was severely outnumbered, fighting a losing battle at the shattered main gates. Black smoke billowed from the armory roof, staining the gray winter sky. The sharp clash of steel echoed up the winding staircase. Chloe pressed her back against the wooden door of her chamber. She listened to the chaos unfolding below. The enemy was moving with terrifying speed, pushing the remaining defenders back toward the inner keep. They knew the king was miles away. A loud crash signaled the fall of the inner courtyard doors. Enemy shouts echoed up the stone shaft. They were searching for high-ranking hostages. They were climbing the tower stairs. Chloe backed away from the door. She scanned the austere room and found an iron poker near the fireplace. It was a meager weapon against armored soldiers, but she refused to cower. She remembered the fierce resolve in Charles's amber eyes when he promised to protect her. She gripped the cold iron, steadying her trembling hands. Footsteps thundered up the spiraling stone steps. The enemy skirmishers reached the final landing. They shouted in triumph, expecting an unguarded room and an easy prize. They were met by the silent wrath of the Shadow Guard. Charles had left 4 of his most lethal personal guards outside her door. They wore unadorned black armor, their faces hidden behind dark steel visors. They did not shout battle cries or taunt the attackers. They simply raised their heavy shields and formed an impenetrable wall of steel in the narrow corridor. The clash was immediate and brutal. The enemy tried to overwhelm them with numbers, pushing against the shields. The Shadow Guards held the choke point with lethal efficiency. They fought with the same chilling discipline as their sovereign. The sound of ringing steel vibrated through the thick oak door. Chloe listened to the struggle, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The battle outside her room raged on. The enemy commanders realized they were facing elite resistance, and they sent more men up the narrow stairs. The sheer weight of the assault threatened to break the defensive line. The wooden door shuddered as bodies were pushed against it. Chloe took a step back, raising the iron poker higher. She held her breath, waiting for the wood to splinter. She closed her eyes, holding on to the memory of the firelight and the gentle touch of his calloused fingers. Suddenly, a resonant horn blasted through the valley. It was not the high-pitched call of the enemy forces. It was the booming war horn of Acadia. The sound was thick with absolute fury. The ground trembled beneath Chloe's feet. She dropped the iron poker and rushed to the narrow window. A massive cloud of snow and dust was rising from the frozen trail. The Acadian cavalry was charging back toward the iron keep. At the very front of the formation rode a towering figure in black armor. Charles had seen through the deception. Halfway down the valley, he had noticed the unnatural movement of the decoy force. They lacked heavy infantry and siege engines. The realization had struck him like a physical blow. He had broken their ranks in minutes, turning his riders around and pushing his war horses to the breaking point. He had returned for her. Panic rippled through the enemy ranks in the courtyard. The attackers realized they were suddenly trapped between the fortress walls and the returning vanguard. Their morale broke at once. The victory they thought they had secured turned into a deadly trap. Charles did not wait for his generals to organize a siege line. He drove his warhorse straight through the shattered main gates. He leaped from the saddle before the animal stopped moving. His broadsword was already drawn, catching the dull winter light. He moved through the enemy forces like a dark storm. There was no strategy or measured formation in his assault. There was only raw fury. He shattered shields and broke defensive lines with overwhelming force. His amber eyes were fixed on the high tower. Enemy soldiers threw down their weapons and fled, unable to stand against the sheer presence of the king. His wrath was legendary, but today it was fueled by a desperate fear he had never known. He fought his way across the courtyard in moments, cutting a path directly to the tower entrance. The fighting on the stairs abruptly ceased. The remaining attackers scattered, trying to escape the ascending wrath of the Acadian sovereign. Chloe heard rapid footsteps rushing up the stone steps. They were too fast and uneven to be a marching patrol. The heavy iron bolt on her door slid back with a loud clang. The oak door swung open, crashing violently against the stone wall. Charles stood in the doorway. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with exertion. Ash and soot coated his black armor. A dark smudge of smoke marked his cheek. He looked wild and exhausted. He scanned the room with frantic intensity. His gaze darted from the shadows to the hearth, searching for any sign of harm. Then, his eyes found Chloe standing near the window. He dropped his broadsword. The steel clattered loudly against the floorboards, a discarded tool of war. Chloe did not hesitate. She ran across the room, closing the distance between them. She threw herself into his arms, burying her face against his chest. Charles caught her. He wrapped his arms around her small frame, pulling her tightly against his iron armor. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling the familiar scent of winter fennel and wood smoke. His large hands gripped her shoulders, anchoring himself to the reality that she was safe. He let out a shuddering breath. The terrifying tension that had consumed him since he saw the smoke finally dissolved. He closed his eyes, leaning his heavy frame against her soft warmth. The iron armor was freezing against her cheek, but beneath it, she could feel the steady thud of his heartbeat. "You came back," Chloe whispered. Her voice was muffled against his dark dornic. Tears of profound relief streamed down her face, soaking the thick fabric. "I told you," Charles murmured. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated against her cheek. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. He reached up, his calloused thumbs gently wiping away her tears. His touch was incredibly tender. "I will never let you go." Chloe reached up and placed her hands over his. She leaned into his touch, her heart finally steadying. The fear of the siege melted away beneath his gaze. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers. They stood amidst the fading chaos of the war, surrounded by the cold stone of the keep. The harsh winter wind howled outside the window, but the room felt impossibly warm. Down in the courtyard, the Acadian generals were securing the prisoners. General Torrin and the commanders knelt in the ash and snow, awaiting their sovereign's orders. They expected the king to emerge and demand a ruthless reckoning for the invaders. They would wait a long time. Charles did not care about the kneeling generals. He did not care about the victory, the conquered valley, or the political demands of his council. The endless winter that had frozen his heart for a decade was finally over. He had found his warmth. He had found his home. He wrapped his arms around her waist once more, holding her in a quiet embrace. The most ruthless king in Acadia had finally surrendered, and as he held her hands in his own, he knew he would spend the rest of his life keeping his promise. Even the coldest iron can shelter a warm heart. Charles and Chloe finally found their peace. Fellow romantics, if their journey moved you, pull up a chair and subscribe. Leave your city in the comments tonight and tell me, Did Charles prove a ruthless king can yield? Until next time, keep the hearth fire burning.